my background is forest entomology, and specifically, the last 10 years I've been a nursery inspector with Department or DNR here in Indiana. Before that, I grew up in upstate New York, and I used to work for the Department of Agriculture up there. I did a lot of different invasive work and quarantine work, but I also worked with seed fertilizer and lime. So I've kind of got a pretty diverse background in terms of my, what we've worked with. But this is a topic, nutrition is something that was kind of brought up to me when I was with the Department of Ag in New York. Paul Cappy, the former apiculturalist, he was really looking at nutrition because he thought it was it was flying under the radar. And I think it still is. So this is kind of my take on it from what I'm seeing within the bee world so far. So we'll go over some of the basics for nutrition, and then as we get into it, I'll kind of go through some of the finer detail. I'm trying not to get too in depth because I think some of it just put a lot of people to sleep. But then I'll end up with talking about some of the kind of the standbys for plants that we understand as good bee plants, but also some stuff that I think is overlooked. So bee nutrition, from the 20,000 foot view, I mean, this is kind of what you're looking at. You got macronutrients and micronutrients, and in terms of your macros, you're basically, it's what we all think of. It's carbohydrates and it's protein. So you got pollen and nectar. But there's a lot of other stuff in terms of micronutrients that, the mineral content, phytochemicals, phytosterols. A lot of these are plant compounds that are produced, and we really don't have a good handle on what exactly they do. So, figures my wife calls me here in the middle of never fails. So a lot of that, there's a lot more research in this type of area when it comes to a lot of other animal nutrition, because bees are 40, 50, 60 years behind in terms of understanding what exactly they need. So for starters, this is kind of just the basics of what a hive needs. You're talking 700 pounds of sugar for a colony of 50,000 in the course of a year. Your nectar content, coming back from a flower, just the nectar load that the bees bring back can vary widely depending on the type of plant. You can have sugar content, in the high 70s, even approaching 80%. And then, depending on who you ask, you're looking at 40, 80 pounds of honey, which has been reduced, nectar. The nectar is reduced down to get your honey. And, in this area, we're probably talking 40 pounds. Northern Indiana, I mean, I got guys up there that swear that 80 isn't enough. So, the other kind of overlooked area that we don't really associate a lot of nutrition coming from, it's just kind of a fluke, but it's honeydew. Honeydew is an excrement from certain insects, mainly scales, aphids, other hemiparins. Basically, they're looking to get amino acids out of the sap, but sap is not amino acid rich, but it is sugar rich. So they have to excrete the excess sugars, and when they do, it comes out in the form of honeydew. So this is a scale, and this is a honeydew droplet that it's producing. I mean, this is one of the ones that we found doing inspections. Spotted lanternfly is something that's coming. It is in southeast Indiana in Switzerland County. It's been found just across the river now in Kentucky. So Kentucky is officially positive. We've got, I think, 5 other counties now in northern Indiana, but it's been found in Cincinnati. It's just found down in Nashville, I believe, in Tennessee. So this is coming. It's not going to be something that you're going to kind of miss, but it is a massive producer of honeydew. And this is the Lanthus. Those are all the 4th instar, with the exception there's a couple of adults up towards the top. this feeds on a wide variety of plant hosts. But, you know, the first time we walked into the site in Switzerland County, it was like going into an apiary. I mean, there's just so much activity. It was just like being in a bee yard. And I don't know where the closest bees were, but they weren't anywhere close to that property. But this is kind of what it looks like underneath. Everything gets coated with honeydew, and any ant, wasp, bee in the area, they're gonna go to it. And then there's a lot of other stuff. So this is a viceroy, and this is specifically tulip poplar with a scale insect. And there's same tree, just honeybees coming to it. So the black that's formed is a mold that forms on the sugars, and it's basically consuming it. And so that's where the nuisance, you know, portion of this comes into play. That's the current map for spotted lanternfly. You know, and it's probably already in dozens of other locations, and we just don't know about it. The good thing about this is it seems to produce decent winter feed, I guess, if there is an upside. So these guys don't generally produce copious amounts of honeydew until later in the season, but when they do, the research out of Pennsylvania is showing that this actually is okay for winter feed. So in that sense, it's not that bad. But on the other sense, I predict, especially in urban areas, you're going to see a sharp uptick in pesticide applications to get rid of these guys because they're a royal nuisance. So it's going to kind of be a dual-edged sword for beekeepers. Continuing, nectar, you know, as I forget what his last name was, our plenary speaker this morning. Clarence. Yeah. So he mentioned, he touched on sucrose and fructose and glucose. Sucrose is the longer chain form of sugar, and there's kind of like an equal divide between the nectars that we're getting. About half of them, we'll say, are sucrose dominated. So the majority of the sugars are, you know, those long chain forms that have to be broken down. But then there's a bunch of other nectars that are glucose and fructose dominated. And those, glucose is the one that's kind of known for granulation. So if anybody ever hears about canola granulating real fast, it's because it's high in glucose. Sometimes they're evenly distributed in terms of sucrose, glucose, and fructose, but not always. And again, the sugar content can range pretty widely, and also something that we don't think about in terms, at least I don't think we think about a lot, is the volume. You know, you can have a high sugar content with low volume, or low sugar content with high volume, and they could be equivalent. But so the table on the right here, this is out of Good Nutrition, Good Bees, and this is just some stuff that I hope you can read this. These are just 3 plants that I'm going to highlight out of here to kind of demonstrate this. This is a raspberry. It's got 12 to 24% sugar content in the nectar. White clover is 41%. And then false acacia, this is a British publication, so this is our black locust. So 63%. So that kind of sticks, I think, with what a lot of beekeepers know intuitively. We think, all right, black locust is great, white clover is okay, and raspberry is kind of so-so. But then, you know, again, how do we evaluate the nectar sources? You know, what are the 2 things we think about? We think about, what did my bees put away, and what am I seeing bees on? And I don't think those 2 things always line up. So again, here's white clover. So this chart shows the volume of nectar that they're bringing back from an individual flower. And this is out of the same book, which I think they take it out of Eva Crane's work. But this is white clover. I mean, white clover had a 41% sugar content, but you're looking at 0.012 to 0.14 milligrams per flower. Now that's not a flower on a clover, isn't that whole thing. There's a bunch of little individual flowers there, but it's still relatively low, especially when you compare it to black locust. You know, you're talking 0.22 to 2.3 milligrams. So black locust is capable, not always that it will, but it is capable of producing a ton of sugar. But then the surprising part is you get down to raspberry and it's 0.18 to 8.1 milligrams. So I think I've seen varietal raspberry honeys that you can get, but it's nowhere around us because we don't have any major raspberry plantings. And that's something that I've kind of noticed is, you know, our bee plants are very ag oriented. So I think there's some stuff that we could be kind of overlooking in terms of nutritional content because it just doesn't get mass planted in an ag setting. So,
Jared, if you would move your mic a little bit higher, you cut out towards the back a couple times.
There's always a challenge with these things.
all right, we'll see if that's better.
All right.
So the next thing is protein and pollen. So, you know, obviously protein, the only source of protein they're really getting is from our pollen. You know, you have 10 essential amino acids within protein that have been identified, and those were all done by the group back in the 50s. Now, there's actually, I've seen some stuff where people would suggest he kind of not misidentified, but miscategorized them. So he had said that tryptophan was the major limiting nutrient among the amino acids. And so the essential amino acids are acids that you can't produce on your own, or the bees can't produce on their own. And so, so that's kind of, I don't know, I guess you could say it's up for debate, but it just remains to be seen because nobody's really tested it. But the protein content, again, it varies widely. You can get 2.5 to 61% protein. You know, and you're going to need 125 pounds of pollen for a decent sized colony. And I mean, that's only, you know, on that calculation, it's 20,000 bees. So 50,000 or more is going to be significantly higher. And the amount of pollen you're getting is really dependent on what your brood is signaling for. Because brood pheromone signals to the colony, okay, we're raising a lot of bees. That means we need a lot of protein. Because the bees transition from needing protein early to adults needing almost nothing. They're all carbohydrate driven. So, and then for kind of protein content, you know, a lot of research has shown that 25-30% range is kind of like the sweet spot, and I'll come back to that here in a second. And then usually real pollen is, you know, shows an uptick in consumption and response versus our synthetic or different applications. But then pollen versus bee bread, they're not the same thing. I mean, we think, okay, yeah, that's the half fermented portion that's, you know, that's the storage portion of the pollen that bees put up. But these are just a couple of things that happen to bee bread. So, you know, you can get stuff out of bee bread that's not in the pollen. So like there's a chemical composition that it's changing. And even, you know, a lot of, you know, there's research that has shown that, okay, you sterilize pollen or you sterilize bee bread and then you introduce something into it and you don't get the same results. So there's a lot of different interactions that are going on within the making of the bee bread.
Is that all fermentation then?
Yeah, there's, you know, when bee bread is made, you know, they're packing pollen into the cell and then they're adding enzymes, they're adding honey, and all those things are interacting. And there's also, you know, there's a microbiome in that is changing. And I mean, it could be yeast, it could be enzymes, it could be fermentation. There's all different things that are going on in there that don't equal, you know, pollen isn't a one-to-one substitute for bee bread or vice versa. So lipids are fats. You know, there's kind of an emerging body of research in this area, but it's not, there's definitely not a consensus. I mean, you know, a lot of these things, you can find research that shows that, okay, these things do have an effect, but do we know what the effect is? Not really. There still hasn't been a lot of research in a lot of these areas to show, you know, you need X amount of, you know, this acid to reach Y outcome. So I'm trying specifically not to get down into the weeds too much on a lot of this stuff, because when I kind of conclude, I think you'll understand here. So, and microbiome, so this is talking about the biologicals that, you know, what's going on in the bee's gut. So the 5 on the left side of the screen, those are the major players that have been identified, but they're starting to do research with basically breaking down gut contents and running RNA and DNA sequencing, and they're finding all sorts of other stuff. And, you know, again, we don't know. Is it good? Is it bad? You know, there's a lot in that area that hasn't been, you know, played out. So for this, you know, the other thing you got to think about is, I kind of alluded to this. I already said that, you know, as larva, protein is a major driver, and then as adults, it transitions to carbohydrates. So you've got nutrition on the individual level, you've got it on the colony level, you know, and within individuals, you got larva and adult. So like it changes throughout the season, and it changes with availability. And then it changes with stocking density. So, I mean, we're keeping bees in an artificial environment in yards with multiple other colonies. That's not natural. I mean, and we're asking them to produce extra honey for us. So we're pushing them in excess beyond what they would normally be getting. But there's a lot of different papers that have teased out, you know, pathogen loads, virus immunity, you know, size and actual fecundity of bees. All these things play into nutrition. But again, the only thing we ever usually talk about is sugars and a little bit of protein. So we'll get into some differences. This is kind of, these are the 10 essential amino acids on the left, and on the right, I think it kind of drives home the point of the difference in what floral sources, you know, that can result from, or result in different levels of honey, nutrient contents. So on the right, you know, you got a lighter honey compared to a dark honey, and there's a lot more nutrient content. Not necessarily as better. I'm just saying, I'm just showing this as a comparison. You know, I mean, I've got some honey that's got buckwheat flavor to it, and some people love it, some people hate it. It's not full buckwheat, but it definitely, you can taste the different flavor profile, and that's because it had a different floral resource that's got a different nutrition in it. So here's some of the clovers. This is white clover, and you know, so to start out with, you know, looking at white clover, these are different cultivars of white clover. So if you go into seeds and you start looking at like an ag supplier, you're going to see a huge variation in what you can get in terms of the brands of clover, the different varieties. So I suspect this was, they're trialing a bunch of these right next to one another and looking at the nutrient content. And this is why I kind of caution that we shouldn't just say white clover is white clover and black locust is black locust, because again, just like with nectar, I mean, there's leucine and you get a huge variation in the amount, threefold variation in the amount of amino acid. And again, here's canola. I mean, there's an outlier. Canola's got decent protein content, but then that one variety's just tanking. And then I'm guessing. Yep.
On your clovers, you talking about white sweet clover or like Dutch white or?
So that white clover there in that instance would be like a Dutch white, but
Okay.
there's a whole,
Alsike and,
well, Alsike's specifically different. So that one is a Dutch white, but there's other varieties of Dutch white. Just like, when I say red clover, you've got true red clover, you've got crimson clovers, their individual clovers are different. Your sweet clover, that's a different species.
okay, I didn't know if you was talking about sweet clover and low
No.
growing.
Just these would be, white clover would just be, that is just basically the Dutch white that you find in
Okay.
your lawn.
Yeah.
So, and then this is basically another chart, kind of showing the same thing, but I think it gives a good visual. Not in the sense that, and I know it's busy as all get out. This just came out a couple weeks ago, but it just shows you the variation. These are all eastern species. Like, there's some stuff on here. Blueberry, I find blueberry interesting because it's got a fairly low amount of essential amino acids, and I don't know if anybody knows, but a lot of blueberry growers have really hard times with pollination after, the bees have a hard time after pollinating blueberries. But that's just kind of like, I throw it up just, again, to reinforce the variability. But then you can also get variation between what are the colonies doing. So this is out of some Australian work, and this shows two pollen collections in the same yard at the same time. But from looking at the right hand side, that's where they broke out the different pollen contents. They actually went through and sorted it. And I mean, one colony is bringing double of one, and for the one nutrient, or for the Patterson's curse pollen, they have one pollen. Again, it just shows that, like, just because we have a preference to give them something, it doesn't mean that's what they're going to want. And then seasonal variation. This is looking at Arkansas. They did some research where it's looking at ag sites versus urban sites. And on the left, on both the left-hand side of each of these columns is the ag site, and the urban site's on the right. And there's actually not that much overlap. So just because your neighbor down the road that's out in the country is bringing in tons of pollen, doesn't mean you're going to be getting the same thing if you're in the suburbs or some other drastically environmentally different spot. So that kind of jumping into supplements, and I'm going to preface this, I'm not endorsing any supplement, and I'm not telling you not to use them, but I'm skeptical about everything until it's proven to. So I think your sugars are pretty straightforward. There's not a whole lot of variation in sugar feeding, other than maybe high fructose corn syrup. That there's been some stuff that shows that high fructose corn syrup can be detrimental, but a lot of guys, especially commercial guys, are using it because they can get it in bulk. It's easy to deal with, so that's what they run with. But going to like protein content. So here's a chart showing, I think this was done by Damien Ellis's lab down in Florida, and what they were looking at is they were testing different protein contents, and so they were in patty form. And again, that 20, 25, 30% range is really kind of the sweet spot. But when you start getting into 40, 50, 60+% protein content, they were actually seeing detrimental effects, like they're going in the wrong direction. I see this a lot in terms of homeowners where they'll say, well, if an ounce is good, a gallon's gold. Well, that doesn't necessarily play out. You know, there's been research to show that the virus mortality is higher. You know, their longevity is shorter. You know, with higher protein contents. So just because we can do it, I don't think that it's necessarily an argument for doing it. There's a lot of other supplements out there. They make all sorts of claims. I've got a couple of them at home. I'm gonna play with them. I have played with them, but I'm not buying it and going whole hog until I see something a little more definitive. Fred Provenza, he did a bunch of animal research, specifically goat and sheep research, but you know, his was all on nutrition research, and it was, you know, what is average, but understanding that average isn't everybody. I mean, the population is in a bell curve. You have extremes. There is no, well, there's got to be somebody that's average, but feeding based on what we think might not necessarily be the best. And then Gary Zimmer, he's a dairy farmer up in Wisconsin. He does like 1,000-acre dairy, and his whole premise is like, he's a dairy farmer. He's got to produce milk, but he's not worried about what he's giving the bees as feed. He's worrying about what's in his soil, because the soil feeds the plants that then feed his cows. So he's going way back, and he has this saying where, you know, this is kind of paraphrasing it, but bugs in a jug aren't going to fix our problems. So here's my whole kind of the way that I look at it. So if we have a diverse biological buffet for our bees, I think that's going to serve them best. And specifically, you know, this is kind of like, what can we do as beekeepers to try to promote their health? So tree-wise, this is a list of, I would say, prominent trees that get a lot of attention, some that don't get so much attention. So this is basswood. I mean, most people understand, or they've heard basswood. It's a great honey producer. It's not real common in southern Indiana. I doubt it's real common in Kentucky. I did find a population of it real close to my house that's very big, and it's on the leeward side of basically a fire break. So the downwind side of a body of water or something that's going to keep fire from coming through, because it's not a fire adapted species. This is real common up in northern Indiana. This is where their major flow comes from, but it will grow around here. The other thing to think about, basswood is it's a linden, so there's all sorts of other European lindens, and you can get stuff that'll overlap in terms of their bloom period. So your basswood might only bloom for 2 weeks, but if you can get 3-4 different cultivars, you could end up with 4, 5, 6 week bloom period. And the other thing to think about, especially with trees, is, you know, a lot of you have probably heard that, you know, a tree can equal an acre. And if you do the math, it's something like, you got a tree that's 50 foot tall and it's got like a 30-foot canopy spread. It essentially comes out to the same square footage as an acre. But I can fit hundreds of trees that size on 1 acre. So, you know, just again, to drive it home, I mean, I'm in a more ag intensive area than you guys are here, but it is something to think about. You know, apples, I got more photos here. That's the problem when you don't take the pictures, you forget. Oh, that's box elder. That's in the maple family. It's an early bloomer. That's black locust, which everybody knows. You know, but here, this is Kentucky coffee tree. I this is something that this is not something that factors into. And I'm not saying if you got a bunch of these, you're gonna make a bunch of honey off of it. But I'm just trying to think along the lines of what is the nutritional content that they're gonna deliver to the bees, or what could they possibly have. Tulip, poplar, Indiana state tree. And lastly, that's profusion crabapple. And I've noticed this one in the nurseries where this gets hit where other ones kind of get ignored. But also with crab apples, I mean, there's literally hundreds of varieties. So you can get a lot of overlapping bloom time. I'd love to go to Ohio State up at the Worcester campus has a crabapple arboretum where it's just nothing but crab apples. And I'd like to go just to see what are the bees hitting, so I could kind of get a phenology, from start to finish, of understanding what's some different things they can do. But if you look, profusion specifically has an extremely long bloom time, and they use it in commercial orchards as a pollinizer.
What's the 1,200 pounds by black locust?
Oh,
That's per
so that's basically the potential honey yield. So if you start looking through literature, they'll talk about Eva Crane started doing it, where she would take flowers and she'd extract the nectar out of it, and then she'd basically run a calculation to try to figure out how much nectar are we getting per flower, and then you extrapolate that out per tree, and then you can extrapolate it out per acre. And so
that's
per acre. So theoretically, you could get 1,200 pounds of honey per acre of black locust, or 1,500 pounds for your basswood and linden. Now, these are all theoretical calculations, but it's a baseline to try to compare some stuff. This is kind of probably the area that I think is most overlooked. So I've got, there's trees, and then people think flowers. Those are kind of the two categories. But shrubs or small trees, I think, is an area that we don't think about a lot. This one here, this is false indigo bush. I have this in my house, and I think the nectar potential on this is something like, or honey potential, something like 200 pounds an acre, if I remember it right. But the impressive thing that I think about this one is the amount of pollen this thing produces. My bees coming back, I mean, they look like they got basketballs on their legs. The only thing I'm warning you is it's fairly aggressive. It's a spreader, but it'll grow in very wet conditions. And it'll also tolerate drought. But it's a decent sized shrub. It'll get 12 feet, maybe 15 feet tall, about the same spread. This is sumac. Again, sumac, I mean, a lot of people it's one that's out there, but people don't realize there's staghorn sumac, there's winged sumac, there's different species of sumac that you can get for overlapping, in terms of what they're producing, to lengthen the time. Buttonbush, this is another wetland species. My bees love this, the bumblebees love this. It's got a fairly long bloom time. This is heptacodium. So this is called Seven Suns flower. It is a honeysuckle, and I'm kind of on the fence whether I should include this or not. I've been washing it in several arboretums, and I haven't really been able to find any source where people are seeing it spread. So I will not recommend anything that's invasive.
What's it called?
Heptacodium, Seven Suns flower. The one good thing about this, and the reason I find it interesting, is it'll bloom in the fall. It blooms into September. So it's something that, it kind of fills that niche that we're all like, all right, what are bees gonna eat now? This is American plum. This is our native plum. It's a thicket forming tree. I don't suspect they produce a ton off of this, but it's a pollinator magnet. Hey, you'll see every pollinator under the sun visiting this, including our bees. But You know, there's some other stuff I've seen, lead plant, Father Gilead, St. John's wort. I've seen the bees visit all that stuff when I've been out doing inspections, but I haven't been able to find any data where it says, well, it's gonna produce this, or, you know, I just haven't seen a lot one way or the other.
What about Vitex? I see that, if that's how it's pronounced.
Yeah, Vitex is, it's called the chase tree. Basically, it's, there's not really any common name, it's just kind of known as Vitex. Here it would be kind of be like a hardy perennial. It's gonna die back every winter. Well, I don't know about here. In my house, I think it would die back. But once it's established, I mean, it should get to like maybe 10 to 12 feet, and it's a later blooming species. It's not native, but it doesn't really
Do
spread.
you know anything about the nectar or the pollen?
I haven't.
I've got a couple of them and they just grow like
Do
crazy.
they die back, or do they regrow from the woody ground above ground, or do they die back to the soil?
I've got them cut back to, they die back to about a foot tall, but they'll get us
Yeah.
covered with blossoms in more in the late summer.
Yeah, I don't know of nectar potential. I
They're
haven't seen anything
bees and
specific.
everything's after something, but I don't know what.
On the Vitex, there are some named cultivars, and then there's the species Vitex. The named cultivars do not produce much that the bees are interested in, but the species
And that's
does.
something, there was a lady that asked me earlier about, different cultivars and different varieties that are bred. What you gotta keep in mind is, nursery industry is breeding for, eye appeal. They're not looking at anything else really. Now, some cultivars could actually be better, but, you know, a lot of cultivars, you know, you think about roses, you know, multiflora rose, the invasive, I mean, I'll see bees work it, but yet you go to an actual cultivated rose and you rarely actually see them on it. So there is variation. I mean, it's just like plant breeding is like animal breeding. We can breed for certain characteristics, but we might be breeding out other desirable characteristics. So then you got perennials. Perennials, you know, this is the other area that a lot of people think about, but like this is Virginia bluebells. And I have a grower that has a very large population of Virginia bluebells, and I see bees hitting it all the time. You know, this is hairy mountain mint. Out of all the potential pollinator plants that are out there, the mountain mints are probably the most distinguished in terms of the variety of pollinators that they'll attract. I mean, this is just at my house, and I mean, I got 3 bees in the shot. They're just moving so fast over this thing. I mean, it's just crazy. But you get golden digger wasps, you get all sorts of stuff.
Don't they bloom into the later season too?
Yep. So they're a later bloomer, but they're in the mint family. And so I kind of suggest it with a caution, because a lot of people that have any volume of mint near them will say it will taint your honey. So for me, this is hairy mountain mint. So, but there's all sorts of mountain mints. So, but again, hyssop is in the mint family. I mean, you got spearmint, catmint. I mean, all the mints as a whole can taint your honey. So, but it's not a bad thing for your bees necessarily. I should say, I don't know that for sure.
Mountain mint is actually a very mild fragrance, it tastes even to the leaves, so.
Yeah.
I've got some big clusters of it, and our honey, I mean, it's
Yeah.
multi-floral.
I haven't noticed any. I've got a big patch of it in my house. I haven't noticed a tainting of any of my honey. But you start talking, I got a 3-acre field of it.
Yeah.
It might be a different story.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's like buckwheat. Buckwheat, you know, I planted 5,000 square feet of buckwheat last year, and there's definitely a buckwheat flavor to a lot of my later honeys.
Linden and basswood makes your honey minty too.
Yeah. I gotta try and make sure I'm done on time. So this is coneflower. Coneflower is not one we think of a lot, but I did find research where it was saying up to 120 pounds of honey to the acre, so the bees are getting something out of it. This is ironweed. Generally, people don't associate this one with being a honey producer, but in the dirt, this blooms late in the summer, and I manage a pollinator garden up at the Indiana State Fair, and they're all over this. Milkweed, common milkweed. This is common milkweed. This has been estimated at like 400 pounds to the acre for honey. So, I mean, plus monarchs need it, so I don't see a downside to planting it, other than it's aggressive, and just plant it somewhere where you're not worried about it running. Cup plant. This is one that I've seen multiple studies where they're talking 500 to as much as 950 pounds to the acre. And again, this one can be kind of aggressive, but this is a big plant. It's a silphium. I mean, it'll get 6 to 8 foot tall. But it's, you know, most of this research that I'm finding has been done in Poland, Australia. I mean, it's all places other than the US. So there is a drive to start studying a lot of this stuff in the US, but we're just kind of starting that.
The cup plant, does that have like a tuber as a root?
No, I mean, it's a fleshy root, but it's not really.
Not like Jerusalem bark
No,
dogs or?
no, but it's, so cup plant, rosinweed, compass plant, they're all kind of in the same family, and they all, I would guess they have similar characteristics in terms of nectar production. The last thing I'm gonna talk about is cover crops. So cover crops is something that we don't think about a lot, but I mean, if we could get more widespread adoption, or even if you're just using it at a small level. Like I said, I planted 5,000 square feet of buckwheat in some unused space in my garden last year, and I don't know how much honey came out of it, but it was enough to drastically alter my second extraction. So this is a guy, he's from up in Columbus, Ohio. I used to buy a cover crop from him, but he runs about 1,200 acres with a minimal amount of herbicide, and that's it. He doesn't use any insecticide, he doesn't use any fungicides, and he's a commercial soy and corn guy. So, I mean, I just say that because it's like, what would our bees like if they were running cover crops? And his soil's some of the best around. So, there's buckwheat, Flacia, scorpion weed. This is an annual that'll readily reseed and come back. That's a canola. Crimson clover. Derek Shenefield, Clover Blossom Honey, is the biggest producer in Indiana. Derek, I mean, he had a couple of years ago, he was trying to rear queens, and he had his cell builders, and he set them all up, and then he came back a couple of days later, and he opened them up, and they were wall-to-wall honey, just everywhere. And he's going, oh man, he had to start all over, but he took a drive around, down the road was like 30 or 40 acres of this in bloom. So, and then red clover, like we shouldn't dismiss stuff. Red clover it's not something that's we key in a lot on, but you know, a lot of beekeepers I've heard say, oh, the bees don't use it, this, that, the other thing. The thought is that the throat on the flower is too deep, but I had a grower, or a nurseryman, that I came around the corner doing a nursery inspection last year, and it was like you were walking on a carpet of bees, and they were all over this, like everywhere, and they were taking both nectar and pollen back off of it. I came back 6 weeks later to see if it was a fluke, and they were still hitting it. So it could be that it's just a varietal. Maybe it's mammoth red clover versus something else, but it's you know, I guess what I'm saying is don't write stuff off just because we don't see it one time and it knocks our socks off. most everything I just said came out of these resources. The stuff on the left, the two articles here, those are both basically journal articles. They're open access, you can get them, and they're easy to read. They give you a really good overview. This just came out on January 1st from the Honeybee Health Coalition. It's an overview and a guide of nutrition. So the four on the right, those are all books. Fat Bees, Skinny Bees is publicly accessible. It's out of Australia though, so I mean you're not going to recognize a lot of the plants in it, but it gives you a little bit more in-depth idea, and it's easy to understand. Good Bees, Good Nutrition, and Honeybee Nutrition and Feeding. Those are both, one's UK and one's a Polish publication. They're going to cost you. You got to order them from England. They're good, but especially the Honeybee Nutrition and Feeding, it's like a college textbook. You're going to be scratching your head a little bit to make sense of some of it. And lastly, the Fred Provenza Nourishment, that's all animal nutrition, but if you got something other than bees, you might find it interesting. So, and then lastly, that's our weekly review. So at Indiana DNR, we put out a weekly review. It's geared more towards nursery growers, so there's going to be lots and lots of stuff about plants and diseases and insects, but I try to keep something in there bee related, but there's also lots of updates for just invasives or just kind of anything that affects the plant or insect or invasive community. So I don't leave much time for questions, but I might be able to take a few. So none? Oh. Almond bush.
It's a really early, I see everything on it.
Is it a prunus, like an almond?
It doesn't produce almonds.
Yeah, well there's lots of stuff. I mean, there's lots of cherries that don't produce cherries, but they're all prunuses. An almond is a prunus, so I haven't seen it, but maybe it's just not hardy enough. But where are you located?
South of Louisville.
Yeah. I don't know. What's that? Soil health? Yeah.
Does that affect
I think it does, but again, it's so complicated to go from the soil environment where you have a bunch of microorganisms and then be able to show that as being efficacious in terms of what the plants are getting, but then show it translating into bees. I mean, there's so many levels there that it's really hard to say one way or the other, yeah, this has an effect. I mean, it's kind of like our ag system as a whole, we try to isolate things so that we can get rid of other variables so that we can say, yes, this practice has this effect, but yet, I think it's kind of a reductionist view where we're trying to look at things too simply, and we don't look at a lot of the other stuff that could be happening down the road. And I mean, to be fair, that's really, really, really hard to do. So.
How far away from where your colonies are located, where your hives are located, is it effective to plant these things? If you plant it really close to the hives?
I think it's anywhere in their flight radius. I mean, if they.
Because I've heard it has to be some distance away, they won't forage right close to it.
I got my hives, and then I've got the field right in front of them with a bunch of stuff in it, and they most certainly they're all over it. So.